We're now going to hear a presentation that is both specific and with some larger implications too, and it's connected to some of the ones we heard earlier today. We're going to hear from Jim Fox, who's the head of the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center, or NEMAC, at the University of North Carolina in Asheville. And the connection I'd like you to bear in mind is with some of the earlier presentations we heard about long-term goals and ambitions for certain parts of the world and certain businesses, and also the emphasis on resilience of different sorts. We heard from J.O., we heard mainly about resilience of the socioeconomic and cultural and health ways of how communities could become resilient with the shocks placed upon them. There's a different kind of resilience that is the main theme of Jim Fox's presentation. I think it's a really interesting one, illustrated both with slides and data and with some concept derived from them. I asked each of our speakers to say a little bit about his or her background. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Jim Fox's. He said that what he views as the sort of guide to his career path is the quote from Tolkien, "Not all those who wander are lost." That he started out with a degree in geology and geophysics, once worked as a petroleum exploration official, and his early maps, he says, were mylar overlays on top of linen-based maps working out of South America. He did that for a long time, then he switched into his current line of work by getting a master's degree in North Carolina. And what he's been doing, as you're about to hear, in his NEMAC Center in North Carolina, is trying to get large weather and climate and other related sorts of data in usable forms for individual decision-making, community decision-making, government decision-making, and all the rest. He also has been part of he says that his group, NEMAC, is the anchor tenant in the Collider, a startup entrepreneurial space in Asheville built around community resilience. I mentioned earlier that my wife Deb and I have been traveling, looking at smaller cities that were repositioning themselves, and the success and importance of these community startup spaces is something that has impressed itself on us again and again. So I will not take up any more of his time, but I'll simply say, for another look at the power of this software in integrating our views of the world and preparing for resilience at many different levels, I give you Jim Fox.
Well, good afternoon. Just a little bit more background on NEMAC. We're an applied research group. That means we do technology transfer, and we're at the intersection of academia, government, and private enterprise. So our nation is experiencing a growing number of threats, and I think you'll recognize some of these shots as being personally applicable. Whether it's the wildfires that happened in Gatlinburg, or the drought in California, or the hurricanes and coastal flooding that impacted the entire Southeast, or inland flooding along the Mississippi River. But we've got this covered, right? I mean, we as a nation spend a lot of money through the FEMA budget, $13.2 billion for really this disaster response recovery. But since I live in the Southeast, I want to put this a little bit into focus because just in 2016, the 4 heavy precipitation events that led to flooding, just in the Southeast caused $16 billion of damage. This isn't talking about any of the rest of the disasters that I mentioned. So even if we could convince Congress to spend all of that money in the Southeast, we're still going to be quite short. Well, maybe that's a one-time instance. Well, unfortunately not. But if you look back to 1980 and going to 2016, this is the billion-dollar disaster events per year. So here's 2 of the problems. We've got an escalating amount of hazards, and we don't have enough resources on a national level through the federal government to bail us out. And so we, as individual communities and businesses, are going to have to start owning this problem locally. And the third big problem is then us. we as humans don't deal with new realities and uncertainty very well at all. We would like everything to be business as usual. Let's use based on past experience of the way to answer the future. And we've seen time and time again in the talks today about ways that companies, communities are positioning themselves for this very complex and changing world. And that's really what I'd like to talk to you about, because partnered with Esri, we are providing resilience solutions to these problems that I've discussed. And I love the way that a lot of the other speakers kind of set up my main points here, that if you really want to be providing resilient solutions for our nation at a way that we can afford them, then you need to kind of be hitting these 3 points. That you need to be building on a risk framework. You know, how am I best investing to reduce this risk? How can this be used at a very local scale? So in other words, how can I make these solutions both scalable and affordable? So let's talk a little bit about resilience. Now, resilience is a word that we see a lot and is used in a variety of different ways. But the way that I really like to think about resilience is thinking about as time goes ahead and we look at our community capacity, we think about working on this even line moving ahead, that we don't have any bumps and things and everything is staying pretty good. Our cities remaining functional, our citizens are happy. But when something happens, whether it's one of these hazards I talked about or some of the other resilience factors that were discussed in other talks earlier, that really bounces us down off of that baseline. And resilience is all about how far down we get dropped and how long it takes us going through time to recover. In Asheville, North Carolina, where I live, we just commemorated the 1916 floods. It was the 100-year anniversary of those. It took Asheville 50 years to bounce back to where they were before 1916. Let's take Katrina. Over 10 years ago, has New Orleans been able to bounce back to their original baseline? Resilience is all about then being able to invest wisely. And this is this green triangle on the front. If you can invest money now to be putting yourself on a higher baseline and to be building this resilience into your community, then when that same hazard occurs, and we know we're not going to be able to stop the hazards from occurring, that it is not going to drop you as far below, and you're going to be able to bounce back sooner. And the judge of if your community is resilient is if you've prepared yourself so you don't drop below this critical threshold, that you are not able to bounce back and remain functional. And this is then the cost benefit that we want to be looking at from a risk perspective, right? Because none of us have unlimited resources. It would be great to think, oh yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and invest in that and that's fine. That's not reality because we have so many near-term challenges in front of us. This is investing in the future, and you have to be very aware of how you're using your business intelligence to be able to do this. So NEMAC is very proud to have partnered with NOAA and Esri to develop the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. How many of you are aware of the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit and have used it? Not very many. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this. This is at toolkit.climate.gov. And what we're really trying to do is to improve people's ability to understand hazards, look at the risks, and really find solutions. And it's not just about communities, right? It's also about landscapes and businesses. When I talk about then community resilience and the link of climate, you've now introduced a complex system. Because everything I've said in this talk has been about this hazard and the impact on the community. Well, climate and its data is one step removed from a hazard. But we know that with a changing climate, the frequency and severity of these hazards is increasing. And so we need to be able to address that. And so one of the cornerstones of the Resilience Toolkit is a risk framework. It's a simple 5-step process that looks about moving from hazards through analysis to really developing options and then taking action. Oh, well, does that sound familiar from some of the things that Jack and Chris were talking about? Yeah, it's about moving from that data through the decisions to taking action. Now, my mom was an English teacher, and so I want you to really look at these 3 questions, because this risk framework is really all about how these questions are asked, right? That if you start at the first with exploring hazards, we can ask a question, did you know? Oh, that's interesting information. But as you start moving through this, you need to make this personally applicable. Why should I care? And then if you want to build resilience on a company or a community scale, we have to move to the 3rd question. What can we do about it? Because it takes a lot of these I's caring to be able to develop community broad solutions for that we. Another bottom line that I really want to be discussing with you is too many times we talk about complex systems as about the data. And whether it's the talk that Chris just gave or the one from UPS or a variety of other ones, did you hear that resonating theme? GIS and the support, it's don't get caught up in the data. Where are you really using that data to be able to take action? So how are we doing this? I hope you recognize the interface here as an Esri Story Map. This is an interactive map interface, and it just so happens to be dealing with some sea level rise on the southern tip of Florida. Beautiful map, but I want to posit to you that no matter how good the map is, that being able to add the narrative to it makes it that much more valuable, right? So why should you care about this map? And why should you want to interact with it? Well, because if you can interact with it and zoom into, say, these neighborhoods in Fort Lauderdale, then wouldn't it be great to see the lessons that Fort Lauderdale is using and move across the peninsula to Pinellas County, which we just saw, to be able to see best practices applied there locally and be able to see what they are doing for great ideas of how to do that. Local action propelled by national best practice. Story map, data feeds. We talked about web services. You see these maps? These are applicable to anybody. They are being powered by Esri's Digital Atlas and the US Geo Platform, which Esri partnered with the federal agencies to provide most of their key data sets into a format that any local community or business can consume free of price to be able to be looking at, did you know? This is allowing us to be moving into this new reality that you're hearing these talks about. This was not possible just even 3 years ago when we started working on the toolkit, that we're switching from this top-down to a bottom-up approach, right? No longer do you have to rely on Jim up here telling you, oh, this is the data set you need. I'm pushing it to you nationally. Everybody is going to really like that, right? No, we're allowing each of you to be looking at your own reality and pull the data that is important to you and your reality. And so that moves us into this other part. We're talking about change. We used to think of GIS as 2D spatial maps. We've recently been talking a lot about being able to view that in 3D. But you see, the 4th dimension is just as critical, because we've heard from speaker after speaker about how their reality is changing through time. And being able to move from just trends to trajectories to really being able to look at what is coming next. So this is a way that you can see these are 2 weather stations close to Tampa, close to Pinellas County, and they are showing annual precipitation. And you can see the solid red line in each of these. This is basically an 8-year story that you can see just even the variability between these two stations that are only separated by less than 100 miles. That variability of precipitation, not only spatially, but annually, is really critical for understanding the reality of what is happening in your area. A much bigger question is, well, why should I care? How is this changing my reality? Well, again, using a story map interface, and again, these data feeds that are coming in from the digital atlas, you can start putting this changing reality of climate and hazards into the other changing realities that you're used to dealing with. This is population density and how it's changed from 2000 to 2015. Well, wouldn't you like to be able to zoom in any place in the nation and then be able to use this slider to compare, to be able to see that how the additional population change is also putting pressure on? Well, yes, that is this reality that people want to consume, right? They are consuming this from the idea of, here is something I value, whether it's my home, where I work, where someone I love lives. And so we did user testing. We asked 50 people to tell us what resilience by location meant to them. And we thought we would even seed this in a different way and ask community planners this question, thinking, oh, they're going to be thinking, about their job and all. No. For every 50 people that we asked, every one of them told us they were focused on these three questions. Where do I live? Where do I work? And how do I get between the two? I don't know if we're an egotistical species or what, but I really like to consume information that way too. Oh, gee, I wonder how that new tax code is going to impact my home and my property. And then I'll worry about my neighbors. But this is this critical thing of why should I care, and how are these things being impacted by changing realities? So this is an application that we have been developing in partnership with Esri to be based on that reality. Do you see what's happening? We've zoomed in far enough that these are individual parcels, individual structures. People can click on their own property and start looking at these changes, these differences of color. The differences of color are vulnerability and risk calculations. They can see how where they live is being impacted by that. But as we start to move from the why should I care to what can we do about it, this needs to be scalable, right? Well, the same application, and you can see where that first zoom in shot is by the arrow there, you can zoom into your neighborhood. This is looking at commercial properties, how they're being impacted by flooding in an area of Asheville called Biltmore Village. Notice that now we're centered on a place that people care about. We can be getting all the analytics off of that and the other panes sitting through there. Notice there's two other tabs, a commentary and an interpretation. It's not just the analytics, but if you want to get the we involved, you need to get more stakeholders tied in. And the definition of stakeholders are people that meet two R's. People that have resources that can help with problem, and people that are willing to accept responsibility. Might be on a neighborhood scale, but by and large, you might need to zoom out to the entire city. This is the city of Asheville, and now looking at all the neighborhoods that are being impacted for commercial property and flooding. And you can see the darker red are showing the bigger areas. And so is this actually a problem that in my area that I work, I should be concerned about? And if you then want to compare that, you can then compare that to the rest of these asset threat pairs. We started with commercial property and flooding. Well, how about residential property and flooding? Or how about residential property and landslides? Or how about critical infrastructure and landslides? For the city of Asheville, we have 23 of these asset threat pairs. If you have limited resources, you want to know where the risk is largest, what sector is most exposed and most vulnerable, to be able to move to the what can we do about it. And if you want to get stakeholders to really understand this issue, I hate to tell you, as a room full of map believers, but less than 50% of the population can actually understand a 2D map. If you can provide the same information in an interactive platform in full 3D, and they can see their own home colored in by the degree of vulnerability, and they can interact with that to zoom in, fly around so they really know where they're at. This is, again, something that you can do in the ArcGIS platform now, is consume the 3D services fully, even in a story map interface, which you're seeing here. By being able to get your stakeholders on board, we can really move to where we want to be able to take action. What can we do about it? And that's investigating options. Remember on this resilience curve that it's all about this calculation. We don't have very many resources. How can we wisely invest to be making sure we're investing in this right green triangle? Well, here's the power of GIS, right? We've been able to consume this information that our community has already put together. All the information you're seeing here came from county tax records. Being able to do the analysis and then really looking to move ahead to what can we do about it and when should we do about it. So the scene in the background is a neighborhood in Broward County, Florida. And you can see the scene in the bottom is very much like a subway map. But the subway is heading through time. We're on a subway line, which is our current reality. And you can see here that in this instance, by about 2020, our current reality no longer exists. We're at a station where we have to change lines. And which line do we take? And how long is that going to last us before we have to change trains again to be able to move forward? This is what resilience is all about. How do we invest today to be on one of these great adaptation pathways to know that we're going to arrive in the future where we want to be? As I started the talk, I wanted to remind you that this is not just about community resilience. A lot of times we require ecosystem services and balancing landscape resilience with community resilience. Esri's green infrastructure projects and others like that allow us to do that. These are a series of maps from projects that we've worked on that actually shows that balance. The other thing we need to do is we need to find ways to really implement this in our new business reality. That entrepreneurial startups and the millennials are taking our businesses in a new direction. That NEMAC is proud to be part of a public-private partnership along with Esri for supporting some of these startups. One of those is Fernleaf Interactive. You can fully understand that as an applied research group that we can provide best practice, but we need companies to be able to scale and deliver this. So Fernleaf Interactive is an Esri emerging business partner and receiving the full support of Esri to be able to meet this challenge as well too. So I would be remiss if I ended my talk without talking about the other great asset that Esri brings into this room, because we've heard a lot about their products, but I just really want to recognize it's the people at Esri that has allowed us to be going down this route. And I just want to call out 4 names. First of all, Drew Stevens has worked with us for numbers of years and had a lot of patience. Pat Cummins on the federal partnership side, Nikki Golding in the public safety solutions, and Jeff Taylor on 3D solutions. You can see that all 4 of those names are coming from a different part of this very large company. Take advantage of this wonderful expertise because we've found that partnership to be invaluable. Thank you very much for your time today.